We're good to start. So, most of you, I think, if not all of you, joined us a couple of days ago at the start of this series. So, it's good to be back, and thanks to EF for having me as a guest moderator for this session. And it'll be a one-to-one with Dr. Harsha De Silva. So, I know you're familiar with the housekeeping rules, but just to recap, the series is designed as an information session featuring Eisenhower Fellows who have recently written or been part of writing something on COVID-related recovery, exit, etc. So today, Harsha will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes on his idea. He has published it, I think, about a week ago. And then I will pose a couple of questions to him and then take your questions and hope to wrap up within 45 minutes to an hour tops. So Harsha, over to you. I'll come back on video when we're ready to have the Q&A session. And meanwhile, I will do share screen of your document so that you can refer to it and folks can see it on screen as well. Over to you.
Okay, thanks Anush. Thanks guys for joining. Trying to take about 15 minutes to explain what I wrote. Actually spent 2 whole days writing this damn thing. So Anush, can you share the screen? Let me move the thing down. Okay. Okay. Can you make it a little bigger? Yeah. So basically, what I'm trying to do is to look at the household income and see how this lockdown has impacted the household income, and then to propose some reasonable income support package. So, like Anu said, I wrote it some time back, and at the time when I was writing, it was 5 weeks into the lockdown, and everybody was saying, "Look, people are impacted," and I was part of fighting for the 5,000 at the time, and that was for a week, and that was based on minimum nutrition to keep people above the poverty line, which is 5,000 rupees per week per household of average of 4 persons. So then I thought maybe I should dig a little deeper to understand how this has perhaps impacted the bottom of the pyramid. So this is a result of that. There are two issues. One is these people have very inconsistent income streams. Not every day they get work, and they are if they're dailies, sometimes they go without any income for a couple of days. If you're a self-employed guy who's selling gram on the road, it depends. If it rains, he doesn't get anything, and so on. And on the other hand, sort of in economics terms, you have what you call an inelastic nature of his or her basic expenditure, meaning you absolutely need to spend certain amount. So these are the two things that we have to consider at the very outset when we are doing this analysis. So I did it, and my conclusion was that there are a lot of people who need some support from the government, and I said each round will cost about $230 million. And I said part of it can be sort of government expenditure, and the other part could be financed through the banks and others. They need not be handouts by the state, but given to employers to pay employee salaries and so on. So now let's go down. So that is really the executive summary. So what I did is I looked at the latest available what is called the Household Income and Expenditure Survey. That is done, make it a little bigger, yeah. That is done every 3 to 4 years. And it's a sample of 25,000 homes. They do it for a period of 12 months so that they don't catch any seasonality with this. And this is the finding. So these are what are called deciles. So you take the entire population of households, which is about 5.25 million of them. And in this sample, you had 25,000. And then you break it into deciles, meaning 10% blocks. So the entire distribution, population distribution, all the households are broken into 10% blocks. So the lowest income 10% block, believe it or not, uh, brought home only 9,916. So that is the last column on your right hand side. That is the mean household income, or in other words, what we refer to as the average. Uh, so if there are rich people, it is sort of skewed towards a high income. A lot of poor people, it is skewed towards low income. But median is what the household expenditure, that is the first column, actually the third column, median household expenditure. Median is when half of the number is on one side and the other half of the population is on the other side. So this is the absolute center. So if you look at the center, the median is about 16,000, but the average or the mean is 9,900. The second 10%, the average is just under 20,000, 19,700. The third decile mean is 26,000. Fourth decile is 33,000, and the fifth decile is 39,000. Now I want you to compare that column with the mean household expenditure. That is one, two, three, fourth column from the left. Mean household expenditure. If you look at the mean household expenditure and the mean household income, you will see the Yathartha in Sri Lanka, right? That is the first, second, third, fourth, and even the fifth decile. They can't make ends meet. So they spend more than what they actually bring in, which is a terrible situation to be in. So this is 2016. And if you sort of think about annual inflation of 5% per year, you can multiply this by about 1.15 and you'll see what the outcome is. If you, Anush, go down now. Hold on a second. Yeah. So the household income and expenditure patterns and indebtedness. Hold on right there. Now, when you look at income of a household, it is not necessarily only monetary income. So money-wise, folks get only 40% of that amount. Rest is, that is in terms of salaries or wages. Then about 8% is agriculture activities. Non-agriculture activities is 17%. Other cash income and ad hoc receipts. So they are all lumped together to get that amount that I spoke of earlier. If you consider expenditure, usually you break it down into food expenditure and non-food expenditure. So the average food expenditure is about 35%, but the non-food expenditure, like housing, transport, payment of loans, so on and so forth, is about 65%. And the lower the income, the lower the amount of non-food expenditure, higher the amount of food expenditure, which means at the lower levels of income in the first, second, third deciles, it is hardly possible to forego of things because you are really spending on what is essential to survive. And that's what I spoke about at the beginning, called inelasticity in basic expenditure. Go down, Anush, and what you see is they are also indebted. Um, I can't see this. They are also indebted. I cannot see. Anush, can you go back up? to the where I was. Go further down. Yeah, so you look at the indebtedness, our households, according to the same survey, about 60% of the households were in debt. And in some areas like Brownia, 81%, and Polonnaru was 70%, and so on. And the average debt that each household was in at that time was about ₹500,000. Uh, uh, and you see ₹500,000 in debt to finance companies, about 350 to banks and places where you work and so on. And most of the loans had been taken either to build or improve a house, or for business activity. You can go to the next one and go down, Anush. Go up to the. So so uh, so what I'm saying is that was what it stood, in 2016, but the annual report just released a few days ago shows that both public and private sector employees had a real increase in their wages. Informal private sector increase was about 19%. So meaning that their incomes in real terms would have increased, but like I said, at the same time, they would have seen about 15% inflation over the past 3 years. So if you go down to the next point, Anush, so what I looked at then was how families were impacted. um, I looked at it in another way, meaning, where are these people employed? Are they in agriculture? Are they in industry and so on? So your 8 million people, you have about 2 million in agriculture, 2 million in industry, and about 4 million in services. But an interesting way to look at it in this context is uh, about um, 4 million were employed, right? Which meant that they got a salary at the end of the month, about 2.8 million in the private sector, about 1.2 million in the state sector. Um, and 1.6 million people were self-employed. And there were others who were employers. Um, and if you go up further, you'll see that uh, another way of cutting it, I made a mistake earlier that only about 3 million were bringing in a monthly salary. 2.6 million were self-employed, and 1.7 million dependent on what they made on a daily basis. Interestingly, about 600,000 people in Sri Lanka work for no pay. Perhaps people did not know that they're called contributing family workers. Now, this lockdown impacted both the supply and demand. It impacted the supply because the factories were closed, hotels were closed, and they just couldn't go to work. And on the demand side, there were no customers, no tourists, no shoppers, no passengers. So demand side and supply side both were impacted by the lockdown. Now, if you go down, what you see, go down further, Anush. Okay, so go to the no next page. Point no further down. I finished 6. Yeah, 7. Go to 7. Right. So no, yeah. So the point I was trying to make is that different people were impacted in different ways. So the category that was going to be least impacted was the workers, public sector workers. If you go to that figure, it's easier to explain. Yeah, to show that thing. Yeah. So what I did here was I looked at the risk of losing income, um, and also whether they were monthly paid or daily paid. So if you're in that red circle at the bottom, you had the lowest risk of being either laid off or salaries cut. Of course, this was pre-PB's request, 1.2 million people, and business owners of about 200,000 and private sector essential workers of about 200,000. So they are the people who I assume would be the least affected. And if you go up to the green circle, that's where most of the private sector workers are. And as we all know, several or many of them have been asked to either take pay cuts or have been temporarily laid off and so on. The gray circle are those who are self-employed. So there is a fairly big risk of losing income, and also their inconsistent income stream. And the blue circle are the daily paid workers who are the highest risk of impact. And these circles really show the size of the circles correspond to the share of the labor force. Now, if you go down, Anush, uh, yeah, go to the, yeah, my, go to the, yeah, that one. Show it, I can't see it. So if you look at this table, right, if you look at this table, what I have done is made two assumptions. One is that there is going to be a certain income loss, and there is also going to be some amount of expenditure that can be cut. So the deciles are in the first column, the previous income is in the second column, and the income loss is in the third column. So that income loss corresponds to the risk of those people losing part of their income. So the folks who are in the lowest decile are those ones who are really daily paid and so on, and the percentage or the risk of losing income is extremely high. And this was for the 5 weeks, and probably the 80% is a conservative number. I probably would have been 90 to 100%. And as you go up the deciles, you see the percentage loss of income is less, as you saw in the figure that I prepared. And then I show the new income after the adjustment of income loss. Then the next column is the previous expenditure, and the following one is the assumed cut on expenditure. Like I said, in the poorest households, you cannot cut anything because you're already not enough, making insufficient amount to survive, so they cannot cut anything. But the second decile, I thought maybe they can cut 5%, the third one 10, 15, and 20%, and so on. Because unlike most of us on this chat, they have hardly any discretionary expenditure. They don't go out to restaurants and enjoy evening outs with friends and so on. So there's not much they can cut. And you see the new expenditure is calculated, and finally you have what is called the new shortfall. So this shortfall of 17,500 is taking into consideration the probability of the loss of income and adjusted for cut in expenditure. And you then see a monthly shortfall to make ends really meet. So you have 17,500, 21,000, again 17,000, and so on. And the fifth decile, again, you see a loss, the shortfall of about 12,700. Okay, go up, go down. So if you assume 525,000 families per decile, because breaking into the equal numbers of 5.25 million, if you calculate that based on the figures that have been shown here, you end up with that amount that I spoke of, which is about 45 billion. And that 45 billion uh, is broken down into those income deciles that I spoke of earlier. Go up further down, 11. So that amount then I compared to as a share of government revenue for last year, at about 2.5% of government revenue. Or if you look at expenditure, it's about 1.6% of government expenditure. And looked at it another way, it's about 6% of the salary bill of the public sector. So it's an interesting scenario because PB has said, look, try and not take salary for a month. Perhaps that can then be utilized to look after a lot of these people who can't really survive. Then I also looked at the monies that we have been promised by various people on the way here. 800 million from the IMF, or 300 million from the ADB, and so on, 500 million from China, and so on. And that gives you a sense of the size of this income support package that I have sort of constructed. You can go to the final one, Anush.
Sure, we have about another minute, Harsha.
Yeah. So, so, so the final, takeout is that all these numbers show that the poorest of this country have been, have taken a massive hit, and they need to be supported. And I've calculated the amounts that need to be sort of dished out, and also perhaps shown some areas where this money can come from. And finally, it is certainly the responsibility of the government to ensure that this happens. And once again, some people have been critical, saying, Harsha, can talk about giving stuff away, but where is the money to give? And I'm actually not saying everything must be doled out as grant. Some people will need to be given a grant, and not only in this country, countries poorer than us have allocated money to be given to folks in absolute dire need, to make them, to keep them alive. But of course, for those people who are employed, those in that green circle, and need not be taken care of fully by the state. The government can come in, central bank can perhaps support, guarantee some long-term low-cost financing to employers to ensure that their employees could be paid. And there's been some activity on that, the 4% working capital facility of 50 billion rupees, which hasn't really gotten off the ground yet in full swing. But that's one way of dealing with part of the problem. So that's what this paper was about. And you guys wanted me to talk about it. And I took 15 minutes and explained.
Thanks, Harsha. I will pose a couple of questions that press you for a few minutes, for about 10 minutes, and then we're already seeing some questions come on the chat. So if everyone can please post any questions that you have on the chat, that will be great. So my first question, Harsha, is about One aspect that you had highlighted in your article, and it highlights a crucial dimension, and that is the total value or cost of such a package will be determined by how many rounds of this would need to be given. So you kind of looked at if it was one round, right? And in your paper, you note, and I quote, the duration of support cannot be estimated with the available data and will depend on how long the lockdown will remain and what the rate of normalization will be. That will become clear in the coming days. Since you wrote this piece to today, do you have any further thoughts on that? Especially since we're coming up closer to Monday the 11th, um, which is supposed to be a day that some of this will be eased up. So you refer to that in the paper. Do you have any update on your thoughts?
Well, I think it will be shorter than longer. I mean, I don't think this is going to go on for another 4 weeks, right? So I think by the 11th, country is going to open in some way or the other. So therefore, the impact is going to certainly continue to fall, not rise. So maybe I'm thinking 2 rounds at the most is what I believe is going to be necessary. And then of course it will have to sort of taper down. I don't know whether you can stop after 2 rounds. Maybe after 2 rounds you can have a 50% third round or so on. But it'll have to taper down as the economic activity picks up.
I think connected to that, we have a question. Maybe you have answered it in part, Harsha, from Heminder. How long can the lockdown continue? Of course, daily income earners already impacted, but when would private sector really begin to feel the heat?
I mean, a little while ago, I was talking to Ashraf, and he was telling me that 90 odd companies, apparel factories, have written to the labor commissioner, uh, telling them that they are unable to pay salaries for April. So that is perhaps well over 100,000 people. So um, the impact is going to be across, uh, all employees. And what I was just trying to showing that figure earlier was, you know, there is a risk depending on the type of employment or income that you continue to sort of earn in what you are engaged in. So daily workers are, the most impacted, most negatively hit. Um, so yeah.
Harsha, my second question to you is delivery modalities. So as you highlighted, these self-employed workers, daily wage workers, cut across multiple sectors. So then location-wise, they're different. Industry-wise, sector-wise, they're different. Types of occupations. So how will such a heterogeneous group be identified and the financial support be delivered or transmitted? Have you thought about the implementation modality? Because I guess unlike India, that has the Aadhaar scheme connected to Modi's bank account opening scheme, where almost with the flick of a switch they were able to deliver cash into people's accounts. In Sri Lanka, even with Samurdhi, we have problems. And as you had highlighted, even some of this, the 5,000 rupee relief also had been problematic. So what are your thoughts on a crucial part of this, which is implementation and delivery of this assistance?
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who's really been fighting with the system over the last 2.5, 3 weeks, I've realized that the current system is extremely politicized. What has happened is the government has appointed the local government member to work with four other sort of Grama Seva level workers, that is the Grama Seva, the Samurdhi officer, the development officer, and the agriculture officer. And now, for instance, if you look at my own divisional secretary's division of Kotte, which I'm responsible for as the member of parliament, the numbers have almost doubled, right, from what the original numbers were. Um, Government minister recently told me that the latest number is almost 8 million households, quote unquote, have been given this 5,000 rupees. Now, if you look at this analysis, the census department says we have only 5.25 million households, and not everybody uh, was eligible for the 5,000 rupees. So how did 8 million households and sub-households, as they call them, receive 5,000 rupees? So clearly the delivery mechanism that we are using is completely correct. It is not working, right? So therefore, it is a challenge. And the best way, I think, given that we don't have an Aadhaar type system, is for the government official, the Grama Seva Niladhari or the Samurdhi Niladhari, to be able to verify who these people are. You know, at the um, daily wage and the self-employed level. But of course, when you go to the next group of folks who are employed, then that's much easier and can be sort of delivered through the employer. But the other two groups, I think, need to be sort of validated by the Grama Seva.
Harsha, perhaps this question uh, from one of the participants goes beyond the immediate, your immediate proposal, but it points to possibly something that many countries are considering right now. And the question is, can we start exploring a model similar to universal basic income to address technology extensively to profile household data?
Yeah, I don't believe in a universal basic income model for Sri Lanka as yet. I don't think we are you know equipped to go there. I mean, of course, they were trying it in some Scandinavian countries and so on, but it is absolutely clear that we need a database, and people started to get this done some time back, but for various reasons it was stalled. And if we had a unique ID, that unique ID would give you the necessary data. As long as the data is protected and the privacy of that data is guaranteed, then in situations like that, situations like this, that data can be utilized to get the money across. I mean, there are two ways in which it can be done. I mean, either cash transfers or vouchers uh, for perhaps food and things like that. Because some of the criticisms that we saw on the ground was that, okay, folks got the 5,000 and went directly to the wine stores and bought alcohol and stuff like that. Those couldn't be sorted out if there was a voucher system. In fact, when we originally introduced the voucher for school uniforms, there was a lot of opposition, and people actually said, if the government changed, they would do away with the uniform voucher and start giving uniform or cloth, what you call cloth. But the new government has continued with the voucher because it works. So that's another way of looking at it. But we need some better mechanism of selecting the people, selecting the beneficiaries, some sort of means tested mechanism of selecting the beneficiaries, and then a better way of distribution.
All right, I'll take a couple of other questions, and I encourage everyone to post your questions because we have a few minutes remaining. Harsha, these two questions are not directly related to your proposal, but somewhat tangentially linked. So Nathan has a question. Why are the banks only giving the 4% loan to companies that have a loan with a bank? And secondly, they are asking for collateral to be able to release the funds.
In fact, I was asking the central bank this afternoon because there's so many complaints coming that people have not been able to get the money. So what they are saying is they just don't have the money, and they're saying is overwhelming amount of applications have come in, and they don't have the money. The fund was originally for 50 billion rupees, and they obviously need a hell of a lot more than 50 billion rupees. So the banks have to be, I guess, uh, certainly concerned about the depositors' money, and they can't be sort of risky with that. So therefore, there's going to be they have to have a balance in the risk they take. So this is where we need intervention in some sort of underwriting by the central bank so that these loans can be given. At the end of the day, Nathan, the issue is, what happens if those people are not paid? Interestingly, I've been reading, not in a local context, but in a global context, that folks have been arguing that the UN Security Council will now have to meet because this is a national global security threat, right? And that both military and non-military intervention can be utilized in situations like this. So if there is a global inability to pay debt, inability to feed people, there will be social unrest, and that can cause tremendous issues domestically in various countries and also globally. I'm not saying that will happen here, but these issues need to be kept in mind. So if you sort of come back to the Sri Lankan case, uh, the intervention from the state at this point is crucial.
Staying with that theme somewhat, Harsha, we have a question from Subra Iswaran. What will the geopolitical repercussions be for Sri Lanka? Do you think we will see even more of a pivot towards China?
Well, at the end of the day, it is going to be, in my view, the big global power, the US, that will sort of be able to come up with some sort of big game plan. If you look at the previous calamities, if you go back and see the Argentinian, Mexican, the crisis in, when was it, 1989, 1990, when the Brady plan, I think it was Tom Brady, the Secretary of State, the Brady plan was introduced. What they did was they converted commercial bank loans into tradable bonds. At that time, tradable bonds were not much in fashion, and developing an emerging market countries didn't have these bonds. So what they did was the U.S. Treasury underwrote them, or they collateralized them with deep discount bonds, zero coupon, long-term U.S. Treasury bonds, and converted those into tradable securities, and then got those off the balance sheet of these countries. So that was one practical way that they got the Latin American countries out of that debt crisis. Then you saw the ruble crisis. You can go back to sort of the Marshall Plan and all that. So there needs to be some sort of global leadership in this, and we haven't really seen that. So maybe various countries could be influenced by other countries in the sort of the short term, but I think in the medium term, there's going to have to be a completely new architecture. and some sort of new instruments will have to be introduced, I think. Because if you even look at the Sri Lankan case, we have, every year about $4.5 billion dollars in debt that needs to be repaid. And most of that is to, pension funds and hedge funds and, funds in the West who's invested in international sovereign bonds, not necessarily sort of bilateral loans and so on. So, in even if you look at the previous case of the Brady bond mechanism, those were just one commercial bank lending to a country, and that went sour. And then you created those new instruments. But in this case, it's very different. You got hundreds of investors, and that makes any sort of new instrument that has to be brought in even that much more complex. So my personal view is that China may try to influence Sri Lanka, obviously, but whether that is going to succeed in a sort of a global mechanism to deal with the COVID debt crisis will remain to be seen. And interestingly, the talk of flattening the curve, we are used to talking about flattening the coronavirus curve, but there is also flattening the debt sustainability curve. Because if countries are unable to meet the debt obligations, then that will sort of get out of hand, just like the COVID problem. So that's
Actually, on the point on debt, I'm going to take two of the last few questions. One is, given the issues related to the debt ceiling, what options do we have in terms of getting funding? Linked to this also is a question posed by Dayananda. Why is it not possible for all political parties to work together to get the country out of this crisis? I put these two together because it seemed like a logical fit, and I can sense where the questioning is also, where the solutions might lie.
Okay, I'll take Mr. Gunawardana's question. First is that, it is easier said than done. Now, for instance, if this process was not politicized, it would have been easier to deal with this issue. And the example that I gave, that I saw personally experienced in the Court Divisional Secretaries Division, is that at the local government level, this was completely, absolutely 100% politicized. So it becomes very difficult when the process is sort of done like that from the bottom to meet without your political hat. So you have to be really strong politically to be able to work together, and that is what we propose to do. So if they wish to, the government wishes to seek the advice or get the opposition parties also to work together, then that will be good. In fact, I was on a television program the other day, and at the end of it, I got a very interesting text, and that was from former President Chandrika. And she wrote me a long text and said, Harsha, remember the tsunami. After the tsunami, I called all political parties and we worked together. We put groups together, and those groups consisted of members of parliament representing different political parties. And why is it that it is not possible to do it this time if we were able to do it last time? So she reminded me of that, and this is perhaps something that we can bring to the discourse as we go on. On the debt ceiling matter, Anush, we have a problem. In fact, since we are not meeting in parliament, we don't necessarily know what the facts are, whether we have breached the debt ceiling or not. According to Nishan at Verite, we've breached it by a large amount. And if so, what do we do? And this is a legal issue, because when we are now attempting to raise finances, whether it is from the IMF or World Bank or issue new paper, you want to make sure that all the bases are covered, that this is fully compliant. So beyond just a local political issue, um, resolving this, making sure that we are 100% within the law, uh, would be sort of, a prerequisite in trying to raise funds to ensure that we can continue.
All right, Harsha, to our last question and bring it somewhat back to the topic of your paper, and also perhaps a good way to close in terms of what can be done by some groups in order to strengthen some of these arguments. So Kala Piris asks, since you spoke about the most affected in this pandemic, the economically disadvantaged, what should be the role of civil society organizations in changing the context? To our understanding, the space created for civil society organizations is very limited. So what are your thoughts on what role CSOs have in pushing forward the thinking around these inequalities, and also dealing with those who are dealing with providing relief to those who are most vulnerable?
I mean, everybody is trying to help at a private level, at an organization level, at a community level, and that can only go so far. Most of you guys, I'm sure, help in this situation, but at a national level, I think there are two things we need to be concerned about: civil society, and that is the rule of law, and democracy. So we need to be within the rule of law. We have to act within the rule of law. So if we are able to make sure that the government is able to work within the confines of the constitution, and then through that be able to make amendments to necessary laws, bring new laws, so that those affected at the bottom of the pyramid can be taken care of, because this cannot be done by civil society. This cannot be done by a private situation, and no government has been called upon, certainly not in the last 72 years, to deal with an issue like this. Right? This is a completely new and a complex challenge. So, in complex challenges, one needs to be able to come up with innovative but legal solutions. So, expert advice needs to be taken. Um, all sort of parties, like Mr. Dayananda said, must try to work together. The civil society must push for um, the functioning of this government in a constitutionally legal way. So I think that's what the civil society can do.
I think that's a good a point as any, Harsha, to close. Thank you to everyone who posed really interesting questions, and Harsha for taking the time to put this analysis together and share it with us on something very important. I think in economics, there is this concept of scarring effects, and particularly in times, so to use a loose and perhaps crude analogy, the results from scans showing of COVID patients show scarring of certain organs, including the lungs, which have lasting impacts. Similarly, even in economics, you have those who lose their jobs or have sex, or who face severe unemployment or underemployment could face these scarring effects where you don't recover with the rest of the economy, where the impacts you face are much longer lasting. For instance, in Sri Lanka, when you have when farm households have successive round of crop failure, or successive rounds of drought failure, even once the weather recovers, their incomes and wealth are scarred, and they are unable to buy the inputs required for the next round of cultivation when things pick up. So I think thinking about the most vulnerable and avoiding that scarring lasting impacts will be useful. Um, I'm going to pass on to close to the other Harsha on the call, Harsha Purasinghe. Thank you very much, everyone. And Harsha, over to you.